Joe Mullings from 160 Studios today, and with me I've got Mark Turco and Rick Geoffrion, and we're going to give you our download on EuroPCR that just passed about a week and a half ago. So Mark, thanks for joining us. Mark, where are you located today in the world?
Today I am in China. I am in Singapore today, and that's why it's a little bit dark in the background here and getting late in the evening, but great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, good to have you here, and always love to get your perspective on this past EuroPCR. What stood out for you? What was absent for you? And what do you forecast the EuroPCR structure look like moving forward?
No, thanks, Joe and Rick. It's always a great meeting, EuroPCR, and on top of that, coming out of COVID, obviously, it's great to be back in person, and it's always a reminder of how much we get done when we can be in person with our colleagues and others at so many levels. But one of the things that I want to highlight, which I think is very important coming out of PCR, I'm a little bit of a history buff, and last year we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the first TAVR case. This PCR, actually, we celebrated the 30th year anniversary of primary percutaneous coronary intervention for acute myocardial infarction. So for your viewers, Joe, and in discussion here, if you think back to the Jeffrey Hartzler days back in 1983, he was called a cowboy during that time period because he performed primary PCI in acute myocardial infarction. I think it was in close to 50 patients or so. And then it took 10 years from that point, ultimately, for the likes of Bill O'Neill, Cindy Grimes, and Jean Marceau to ultimately really bring primary PCI versus thrombolytic therapy into the forefront, showing that primary PCI was superior to lytic therapy. And that set the stage then for primary PCI as the default therapy for acute myocardial infarction. And why is that important? Well, everything we do in the medtech sector should be patient-oriented. And the fact is, we went from a mortality which was high double digits to now where we are with a mortality for acute myocardial infarction treatment to low single digits. So it's a story of perseverance and really some great accolades, I think, for our medtech sector and for the clinical investigators and everyone that participated in much of the trial work. So I just want to highlight that. The other was the innovation session that occurred on the first day of PCR. And the session was actually, I think, very well attended. And there were groups of technologies that were highlighted. And it really shows where we are today in concentration. One, and they combined mitral and tricuspid therapies. Secondly was heart failure. And then third was actually pulmonary embolism, which is really an area that is under fertile investigation with many therapies and many companies involved in the development of technologies for the treatment of pulmonary embolism. And then obviously there was coronary and renal denervation that was thrown into the mix as well. But that session was very, very important. And as is always the case, and I think you guys highlighted in your session prior to PCR, there was also a lot of talk about data, artificial intelligence, et cetera. And the idea that AI was to be used as an enabler for technologies moving forward. And I like to use the 3 Ps, the prevention, the prediction, and the precision of our therapies. And that's where the algorithmic and technologies and artificial intelligence is going to drive our smart devices. So I'll stop there. There was an awful lot of other things that occurred throughout the sessions, and I'm sure we can get into them, but I just wanted to highlight those pieces to kind of kick it off.
I love the homage to the history of PCI for sure. Certainly promise for those procedures and or technologies that might not get traction today, but sticking to it and showing an evidence-based outcome is critical all the time in this industry, not just what the flavor of the month is. Rick, you and I were chatting this morning, and what came up oftentimes was this optimization of the technology also that exists today. And it seems to be a little bit more of a focus as making the pie bigger for operators and imagers. And so what was your takeaway from EuroPCR in that area?
Well, really, it does get back to some of what we discussed prior to the meeting, and that is the facilitation of procedures, procedure throughput, because that's what hospitals and institutions are really interested in right now, especially at a time post-COVID, again, where I think the statistic was 46% of the hospitals in the United States right now are operating in the red. Mm-hmm. So, not a lot of cash out there for investing in large new systems, et cetera, but how do we take what we have and make it better and make it more productive? Now, when you bring that over to the industry side, there are a bunch of new devices out there, and specifically, if you want to look at structural heart, for example, that need to scale. There are some that have fantastic clinical data, but they're really limited in their ability to just quickly scale into the market through training, through facilitation, through the fact that in like mitral and tricuspid valve, for example, procedure times, on average, 2.5 hours. So that means you'll have a 4-hour procedure sometimes. How do you get throughput? How do you get, procedure after procedure? How do you get up the learning curve? How do you get all that done when you have long procedure times, when the facilitation of the procedure is still pretty inefficient, actually? So that's where AI can come in, as Mark was saying, through precision. There was some talk at the meeting about using AI, for example, to work on the positioning of ultrasound probes. When you're looking at imaging a procedure, there's the fluoroscopy, right, the live X-ray, but then there's also a 3-dimensional ultrasound that's imaging the heart. So you have an operator that brings that down into the esophagus and manipulating it around to try and get specific angles in a specific valve for a specific device. And so they'll get an angle and they'll get a nice image, and the operator who's on the other side of the room goes, okay, that's perfect. Okay, wait, stop right there. Okay, and then okay, that's good. Now I need to see this angle over here. And they go to an angle, they manipulate the device again. They say, well, go back to where you were. And they go, wait, how do I go back? So some of the most talented folks can do that, and there's others like it takes forever, and all of a sudden I can't find that image again. So that's where things like AI can come in, because there's all this information that's being created, and how do you take that and then make that and lay it up and make it efficient for these two physicians, one who's an imager and one who's the operator, to do it more effective.
Yeah, and you and I talked about that. I give a very crude fundamental is, depending on what kind of car you drive, you pull your car in, and there are a whole bunch of imaging capabilities on it, and you look in your screen, and there's a composite as if there's a drone above you that's able to form a composite.
Say, how is that? There's nothing above my car.
Right.
I can see my entire car in the parking space.
That's right.
It's
so I think coming back to the imager is the use of AI and the ability to aggregate and composite these images will shorten that time and make an average operator maybe a little better.
That's right.
And also decrease dramatically the throughput on that.
I think another thing we'll see is we'll start to see certain alliances between the imaging companies and the device companies, especially the larger ones. So if you have an established device, so a device, let's say in the mitral valve, where there's good clinical data, so you know it works. Now how do you get it into the market? How do you get folks trained and using it, up learning curves, et cetera? Part of it is the imaging and all of that facilitation. If you can see it, you can do it. If you can't see it, if you're waiting to see it, you lose momentum, et cetera. So some customization on the imaging side, specifically for a specific device that has high potential to scale, so that it actually can scale. I think we're going to see some of those alliances going forward.
Great. Mark, what are your thoughts on that? We've watched forever. The imaging companies have stayed outside of the body. The internal interventional have stayed inside the body, and then we've got an N of 1 on this. We've seen the Corindus acquisition recently just be put on mothballs, at least the PCI side, and there's sort of different mindsets and different cultures, right? The interventional versus the external imaging side. What are your thoughts on the future there?
Yeah, I think, that ultimately there's going to be much more of an integration, a continued integration of the imager and the operators and, the imaging companies and the medical device technologies. You have to have that, especially in the complex world that we live in now in the medical device sector with some of these valvular technologies in the structural heart space. So I really do think that we're going to be moving in that direction. What's going to be key on the imaging side, and, Rick pointed out the training and the education, which is obviously very, very, important for, the patient outcomes and physicians. But it's then also the integration of, the data, the AI, to what I spoke to early, which is around the prediction and the understanding almost from a phenotype standpoint of which technology you use for which patient and how best to improve that patient outcome. And then, the other piece of this is, and we've seen this with IVUS, we've seen it with OCT, we've seen it, with some of now the CT guided therapies, and where FFR, IFR, all of the hemodynamic and physiologic technologies, these have to be integrated into the care flow for a physician. Otherwise, physicians are not going to utilize them. And there has to be, and we've spoken about this before, reimbursement as well for the technologies that are being used that are going to take time to help improve the overall outcomes of these procedures. But until they really improve the care flow and the way the patient is being treated through its continuum from pre-procedure, peri-procedure, and then post-procedure, I think it's going to be hard to get a broad-based adoption. And I know all the big strategics are working toward this market development, and we will get there, but it's going to take a little bit to get to ultimately a broad-based utilization of all of the technologies that we have to help outcomes.
You bring up a really interesting point here, and I had noticed that at EuroPCR, is we're becoming more and more sophisticated as we collect this data on the risk stratification of the patient, and then maybe a care pathway. Because you can fall into that Maslow's hammer as an interventionalist, is if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think downrange, what we're going to do is we're going to have this aggregation of data and perhaps an AI advised care pathway that then the doctor or clinician or interventionalist confirms, and then maybe picks best in class for the solution based on the patient on a number of variables, rather than the one that they're using today because they're aligned with that OEM in that either structural heart solution or either imaging solution.
Yeah, I mean, every device has a certain benefit risk, right? And so some devices have a little bit more risk, but in a very sick patient, the payoff is huge. And so if you can use AI, for example, to help understand what that is and what that continuum is, which was what Mark was discussing, could be a real benefit.
Yeah. Mark, you had mentioned mitral, tricuspid, heart failure, but also EuroPCR. We know this is almost by design a right down the middle, PCI-driven sort of conference meeting. But you've also shared perspective. You and I were on a panel in Boston just a couple of weeks ago. That was a lot of fun. Is we're starting to see these solutions of the heart failure specialist, the interventional cardiologist, the coronary surgeon, now starting to build these teams of care around solutions. Is there still a place for these meetings like London Valves, Valve Structural Heart, EuroPCR, primarily PCR? Where, other than TCT, does this convergence happen, or should it be happening moving forward for both the technology development as well as the patient outcomes?
Yeah, so I think, Joe, the one piece to this puzzle that I would put in there is that face-to-face interactions are important. And, during COVID, we never attended meetings outside of the Zoom and Teams meetings. And now that we're back regularly attending meetings, again, the efficiency of seeing people face-to-face, learning and developing the collaborations, especially for the younger folks in the field that are starting out and want to work with industry, these meetings are important to have live. What we're seeing now is in these meetings where you have everything is a heart team for the most part. And the meetings are helping to propel that and bring that back to the institutions. And, if you even look at on a regulatory side of things, our trials that we submit for regulatory approval to the FDA in areas, for example, of structural heart, have to be from a team approach to determine, which patients should be selected for what procedure and whether that patient meets inclusion and exclusion criteria. And it is good to see cross collaboration between the different disciplines, because it's only going to make us better. And I do think the meetings help us, whether we have too many meetings because there's all of these valve meetings and then all of these coronary meetings. That's something certainly we can debate and how many meetings we need. But overall, I think it's great to be in person. And I think they have helped foster the interaction between the disciplines of imaging, of surgery, of cardiology, and intervention and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Good, Rick.
I would agree with Mark, and it is valuable for young physicians to go and learn, but it's also really valuable for the innovation side of the industry. When we think about the small companies in particular, which really don't have the budgets, right, to just fly all over the country or fly over the world to see different KOLs at different places. And by the way, when they do that, it's not just the money, it's the time they lose that they should be there working on their device, and instead they're flying around the world. So to be able to go to one place or a few different places a few times a year to meet with a group of physicians in one place and get a cross-section of views is incredibly valuable for these small companies as they design their new therapies.
And as we close out here, one of the things is whenever you're at a EuroPCR or Euro show, you obviously get an over-indexing of European and especially Asia Pac participants, and then you come to the U.S. and usually it's a lot more U.S.-centric as far as attendees. What I did hear time and time again is still the suffocation of the EU MDR and the sort of challenge on running trials and new technologies. HEU, what do you forecast happening there over the next 1, 2, 3 years that's going to bring back that robust clinical excellence and clinical opportunities we had outside the U.S.? I love it for the U.S. market, but I don't love it for my OUS market. So, Rick, what are your thoughts in that area first?
Right now, it really only exists more. I mean, right now, it still is a challenge to perform early stage clinical research, by and large, in Europe. You can go to Eastern Europe where there are some opportunities, and there are some actual vehicles that have been created to make that more efficient. And there are some other places around the world where it's possible, but the core kind of Central Europe, it's a challenge. But in the United States, fortunately, there isn't, again, an early feasibility studies program that still exists and still is robust. And you do have an ability here to perform early stage clinical research. Maybe not the very first patients, but still at a very early stage, perform good clinical research here in the U.S.
Yeah, thanks. And Mark, your thoughts on that as we wrap this up, on the suffocation of technology development in Europe because of that?
Yeah, this transition has been a tough transition, obviously, going from MDD to MDR, and everybody has suffered through that. Small companies, large companies. It's not, just the startups that are bothered by it. And to Rick's point, I think the United States FDA has done a great job under its leadership on the device side to basically help propel clinical research in the United States. I think what we need to work on in the United States right now is how to speed up the contracting and budgeting work that occurs at the site level. That is what right now is the big gating item that sometimes can take upwards of 6 months to get a clinical site up and running and get a clinical trial agreement and a budget agreed on and so forth. And ultimately, if we can get those to where they're customized so that and I know MDIC and Rick has had some leadership here in trying to move these type of initiatives, forward. I think that's where we need to go. Europe will come around. It's just going to take a little bit of time here for people, to basically understand exactly what data and evidence is needed for MDR, and for all of us, within this field to kind of raise the bar, the MDR bar that's going to be needed. But it will come back, and we're still seeing, even in the United States, a lot of very early first-in-human cases done in countries like Georgia and other areas. Ultimately, I would like to see some of those move back into the United States and continue to improve at that point.
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate the debrief on EuroPCR. I know our audience always does as well. Mark, I'm going to let you go. You're probably just ending your day there. Who knows what you're up to these days? But I appreciate your time and your expertise as part of our organization as well. And Rick, always a pleasure, my friend.
Thanks, Joe. Good to see you, Mark.
I'm Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.